Good afternoon, everybody. After Geoffrey's very eloquent speech, I'm going to talk about law. So I hope you will still be awake in 20 minutes, but I'm going to try to make it interesting for you. I'm from the Netherlands, and I'm going to talk about Dutch law, and I'm also going to talk somewhat about the European view of where we are regarding children in same-sex families in Europe at the moment. But first I want to link up with something that Fergus Finlay said this morning, that progress is on the way, it's inevitable. And if I look back to the situation in the Netherlands 15 years ago, there was nothing. There was no recognition of same-sex partnerships, of families, nothing. And now civil partnership was introduced, then marriage was opened, adoption was introduced. And now there's a consultation bill which would give more or less female couples the same rights as different sex couples regarding their children. So in 15 years, these huge steps have been taken, one step at a time, but they have been taken. So I think change is on the way, probably also for Ireland, I hope, but it may take time. And as Geoffrey said, that's a difficult issue because there is no time, really. Okay. Well, I think why is legal recognition of parenthood important? I think we've heard about that today a lot from the children, because it gives you recognition of your family as a family. And when your family is recognized by the law as a family, that really gives you it gives you status, and other people have to recognize your family as such. And what Geoffrey also talked about, being recognized as a parent, regarding medical care, regarding at school, that people, if you recognize you as a parent, so you can actually take care of your child in daily life and are not left out. And what I also think is important, that when a couple raises a child, that they have equal rights. If they're equal parenting, that they have equal rights and responsibilities with regard to their children. And this is important when they're together, but maybe even more important when they separate, because then even after separation, a child has a right to still have contact with the other parent. And I think it's even more important when one of the parents dies, which can happen, which does happen. And then the child, it's also in the report that the child is sure that she or he can stay with the other parent and need not go off to other family members, but can stay in the environment where it's growing up at that moment. And I think it's very important when you're talking about this issue to shift away from equal treatment of adults to equal treatment of children. It's really about the legal rights of children here. Well, as we've heard before, there is of course a variety of families we are talking about. And that's one of the problems when you're legislating, is that you can't just make one rule that covers all these families. You can't just take different sex parenthood regulations and put them on like that, picture them onto same-sex families. You may encounter difficulties there. I love this picture of the two women with their 4 babies. I have twins and I have huge respect for them, that they're raising 4 kids of the same age. And the dads as well. And of course, in the Netherlands, there's an increasing number of extended or shared families where gay and lesbian couples have children together and actually share the parenting. And that's also where one of the problems with regulations come in, because law does not recognize more than 2 parents on the whole. And I think the legal issues, when you are trying to regulate for all the families, there are, of course, plenty more families than just the 3 families that were on the previous sheet. But these are basically some of the legal problems that you can encounter. Well, the first, a child can only have 2 legal parents in most European systems. A birth mother is automatically a legal mother, which may be problematic for male couples who are raising a child together, for both of them to get legal rights. A biological father, a known donor, may have rights with regard to a child. And a child has a right to know its origins if you look at the convention, the Children's Convention that Geoffrey also mentioned. I think these issues, when you're making law, have to be looked at. I now want to go back to a European perspective and see what we have. A lot of countries in Europe, well, a lot. There are 6 countries in Europe which have opened up marriage, but it's really growing, and 2 of them very, very recently, Iceland and Portugal. Then there are the lighter blue countries. The dark blue countries have opened up marriage. The lighter blue countries have introduced some form of same-sex partnership. Well, in the red countries, there are legal impediments to same-sex marriage. But if we look at the countries that have some form of regulation in Europe, it's really, really growing. But then we're talking about adults. If we start looking at adoption, which is usually the first step that's taken by European countries to recognize same-sex parenthood, there are far fewer countries who actually have introduced adoption. A number of countries have introduced adoption where you can either adopt jointly or adopt your partner's child, and there are a number of 2 countries who have only introduced adoption of your partner's child, so not joint adoption. But still, not that many countries. In the Netherlands, started with introducing adoption, I think in 2001, and there has been discussion ever since, because they feel it's not really the right approach to families who are starting out. And it was meant as a child protection measure. And that's one of the downsides of adoption, at least that's in the Dutch debate, where the first step has taken. It's a child protection measure, so it may involve social services, etc., whereas you're simply starting out as a family. You're not taking a child from elsewhere, but you're starting, if you're talking about female couples, starting your own family. Moreover, it's a voluntary step to take, whether you do or do not adopt. So if you plan to have a child together, and the child is born in your relationship, and the partner thinks, well, no, they're separating, I'm not going to adopt, then there's no one who can force you to take responsibility for the child. So it's a voluntary step. And another downside, which was in the Dutch debate at the moment, that it doesn't work from the moment a child is born. There a lot of time usually elapses between the birth of the child and the actual adoption. In the Netherlands, they've now amended the adoption law that you can apply for adoption before the birth of the child. And if the adoption is granted after the birth, then it will work back until the birth. So you can work around that, but that's one of the downsides. I'm going quicker than my paper. Okay. A far smaller number of countries in Europe have recently introduced legal parenthood without adoption. So you don't go through the adoption process, but it's either automatic or without court intervention. So that's really a big step forward, and you come closer to regulations for heterosexual couples. Norway, this only applies for female couples. The UK, where there is a regulation for female couples and a different regulation that male couples can use. I'll come back to that later. Spain, also for female couples. Sweden and Iceland. And as I said before, in the Netherlands, there is at present a consultation bill out, which would more or less do the same. So we are no longer ahead of the rest. Basically, if you look at these regulations that are aimed at female couples, then, well, as I said before, the birth mother is the legal mother. But how about her partner? Most of these regulations only apply to donor insemination in a clinic. If donor insemination has taken place in a clinic, then the female partner can very easily become a legal mother. Either she becomes a legal mother automatically, or she can easily apply for it. But if it does not take place in a clinic, if you ask a friend or a family member or a relative to supply sperm, then these rules do not apply, and you will still need to go through the adoption process. But for a large group of people, automatic or more or less automatic legal parenthood is accessible in these countries, but only for female couples. An example is what has already been mentioned, the revised Human Fertilization and Embryology Act in the United Kingdom, where you have to make use of assisted conception services. And then for people who have entered into a civil partnership, both women will automatically be parents. And if you've not entered into a civil partnership, then you have to sign consent forms before and after the birth of the child. And then you can also register on the birth certificate, both as legal parents. So that's an example of this kind of legislation. In the Netherlands, they are looking at a different kind of legislation in this area. But what I think is important, what we heard from Jeffrey, the speaker before me, that the main aim of this legislation or this consultation bill is that we need to protect children. And it sounded very good what the Dutch delegate said, but that we are looking at children and not at adults. But that's only very recently, because also in the Netherlands the whole process started with looking at adults, and now the focus has shifted finally to looking at the rights of the children and their protection in their family. And the main aim is to make sure that children grow up in a stable family, regardless of the sexual orientation of the parents, but to really protect this stability. Another aim of the bill is also equal treatment of same-sex and different-sex couples. So there's also an equal treatment issue, but it's not really the most important. On the basis of these, a report has been written with these two aims at the outset, and they advised more or less to make parenthood for female couples automatic when they're married or in a civil partnership. But the minister who presented the report said, well, I think we also need to look not only at the family, but at the rights of a known donor, maybe, at the protection of the rights of the biological father. And then, of course, it becomes very complicated. But the European Convention of Human Rights not only may be used to give shape to lesbian family protection, but it also specifically gives shape to the rights of a biological father. So there you get into, always in the European Convention, you have to start weighing and balancing these two rights and see where you end up. A new study was done into what the European Convention says about the rights of the biological father. And as a result of that, it has to be, these rights have to be taken into account in the Dutch legislation, which makes it again more complicated, but on the other hand also gives, well, credit is not the right word, it portrays life as it is for a child with two mums and maybe a known dad, but it makes things more complicated. I'll try to explain to you what the Dutch proposal is like. I hope to give you some idea. Well, 2 women, baby, and a man. A differentiation has been made, again, on family form and status, whether there's a marriage or a registered partnership, or whether people are not married, and between whether the couple have used a known donor or whether they have used an unknown donor through a clinic. And the idea now is that if a couple is married or has entered into a partnership, those are really equal under Dutch law, except with regard to, I think, still children, that's the only thing, but after this law is introduced, there will be no difference. If a couple is married, a female couple, and they've used an unknown donor, then they'll both be legal parents automatically, they can just register on the birth certificate if they show a form from the clinic they've been to, and they're both legal mums from the start. If you're married and you've used a known donor, then things become more complicated. Then the female partner will have more or less the same position as an unmarried father. She can go to the registry with the mum and recognize the child, but then you have to go somewhere and actually do something and recognize the child, and then you'll be a legal mom as well. And that also goes, the same rule applies to unmarried couples, whether or not they've used a known or unknown donor. But in the end, all couples can actually acquire legal parenthood. Most of the time. There are some very small exceptions where a known donor actually has family life and he has a relationship with the child. Then they may run into trouble on recognition, because the donor will have a right to recognize the child as well. So there may be some problems there. I'm not sure how that will work out, because I think they've introduced conflict here, because they have not really made a choice for the family, the family where the child is growing up. So I'm not sure how that's going to work out in practice. I hope there won't be a lot of conflict on these issues, but I'm not entirely sure of that. I hope this is clear. So I think it's basically a good proposal, and it's really progressive in many ways, because it does not only regulate insemination with unknown donor sperm, but also where a known donor is used. So it does the whole thing, but it only applies to female couples. And I think if you look at Europe, male couples have far children who grow up with gay dads. Their position is far less recognized and far less protected. If you look at male couples, I think the UK at present is the only country in Europe which allows gay dads to become a parent without adoption through a parental order. I think it went in. It's valid as of April 2010, so that's only very recently, but they're the only country. And you still have to go to court, and you have to apply for a parental order, but it's a completely different process. It's not adoption. So they're the only country who actually has something like this in Europe. In the Netherlands, there's hardly any regulation for gay dads. They have to adopt, which is very, very complicated, because the birth mother is a legal mother. And it's very difficult, even if she's willing to give up the child and she says, yes, it's your kid, you raise it, you become legal parents, and it's still very, very difficult to actually both adopt a child. And I think that goes for most of Europe. So at the moment, lesbian couples, kids in lesbian couples, their situation is really, there's a lot of progress is made, but for children in gay families, I think that's not really the case. I hope, and that I see that in the Netherlands, that once you have legislation for lesbian families, that gay families will say, well, this is really not fair. There's discrimination because they can become parents far more easily than we can. So, and if you look at the point of view from the kids, which is really what you've been doing all morning, there's no good argument against that. Or you can come up with arguments, but if you look at it from their point of view, you have a family with two parents, and you want your parents recognized as parents. But, well, what I call extended families, I don't know if there's any other term, but in the Netherlands there's a growing group of shared parents, because it's very difficult for male couples to adopt a child. You see that there's more and more agreement that people agree to raise a child with two couples, a female couple and a male couple. And that's really, I think, very difficult to regulate, because, well, I think most of Europe, well, all of Europe has the two legal parent model. And, well, are there other solutions? Well, what I find interesting, the United Kingdom, for instance, allows more than two people to have parental responsibility. So there a solution is sometimes found in giving three parents, and I think you could possibly even give four parents parental responsibility, but sharing out parental responsibility, so when the child is living 50% with the mums, they can take care of the child in daily life, but at least one of the dads has parental responsibility as well. So when the kid is the other 50% with the dads, that the dads can go to school and have access to medical care, etc., etc. So that may be a solution, that you extend the number of people who can have parental responsibility. In the Netherlands, only 2 people can have parental responsibility, but they need not necessarily be the parents. So if you have 2 women and a man raising a child together, then, for instance, the man and the birth mother can be legal parents, and the women can share parental responsibility. So there is some possibilities of sharing responsibility and parenthood among 2 couples. And that's one of the reasons why parenthood is not automatic if you've used a known donor, because then you would cut off this possibility of sharing the different rights and responsibilities among parents. Well, this is not, well, what I want to say at the end, I think in Europe change, it's slowly coming, but it is coming. If you look at the situation 15 years ago, it's so different. And so I think if you look back 15 years from now, it will be hopefully completely different then, and most countries in Europe will have recognized same-sex families. What is also at the moment is far easier to regulate for female same-sex families than for male same-sex families. We've seen that, well, and what I find interesting, but that's probably having to do with extended families. Can we come to a system where a child can have more than 2 legal parents? But I think that's way ahead of where we are now, so I'll leave that be. But I think the most important thing that I want to say, and that has been said by everyone before me, that we should look, all the children, they have a right to the best legal position possible, and it should not depend on who their parents are and the sexual orientation of the parents, or even how many parents they have. They simply should have the best possible legal position that's there. And I think there the international law really requires all the countries to do that, because the child's interest here should be the paramount consideration. I hope this has been of some help to you. It's a bit brief, and law is always boring in a way. I don't think so, but it's less interesting than stories from children, and I think the stories from the children are really important for the law, because when you listen to children, you cannot come up with any valid, or it's difficult to come up with valid arguments not to give them the same rights. So I wish you good luck.